The maintenance tunnels deep inside the Imperial Dreadnought were hot, cramped, and filled with the constant hum of machinery that never slept. Katie squeezed through a passage barely 2 feet wide, her small frame covered in grease and coolant stains. At 11 years old, she was one of the youngest slaves aboard Emperor Draken's flagship, but that just meant she could fit into spaces where nobody else could go. That's all humans were good for in the eyes of the Dracovians. Small hands for small spaces. Nothing more. The massive ship stretched for miles in every direction, a floating city of metal and power that housed over 10,000 souls. Most of them were Dracovians, the towering reptilian beings who ruled half the known galaxy with an iron fist. They stood nearly 8 feet tall with scales that shimmered like polished armor and eyes that looked at lesser species like Katie the same way humans might look at insects. The rest of the ship's population were slaves from dozens of conquered worlds, all serving the empire that had destroyed their homes. Katie had been on this ship for 3 years now. She still remembered the day the Dracovian raiders came to the mining colony where she lived with her parents. She remembered her father pushing her into a storage locker, telling her to stay quiet no matter what happened. She remembered watching through the crack in the door as her parents fought with nothing but mining tools against soldiers with plasma weapons. She remembered the moment the weapons fired and her parents fell and never got back up. The Dracovians had dragged her out of that locker, examined her like she was livestock, and decided she was young enough to be useful. Now she crawled through tunnels cleaning coolant lines, replacing burnt circuits, and fixing things in places the massive Dracovians couldn't reach. The work was hard and dangerous. Last month, a human boy named Tommy had touched the wrong wire and the electricity had killed him instantly. The Dracovians had simply pulled his body out and thrown it into space like garbage. They replaced him with another slave the next day. That's how much human lives mattered here. But Katie did something that none of her masters expected or even knew about. She paid attention to everything around her. While the Dracovian engineers shouted orders and ignored her like she was part of the machinery, Katie listened to every word they said. She watched everything they did. She learned how the systems worked, how the great ship flew through space, how the massive engines bent reality itself to move faster than light. The other human slaves thought she was crazy for caring about such things. "What good does it do?" they'd ask her in the cramped quarters where they slept on thin mats. "We're slaves. We'll die here. Learning their technology won't change that." But Katie couldn't help herself. Her father had been an engineer back on Earth, and before the Dracovians came, he taught her how machines worked. How everything had a pattern. How if you paid attention you could understand almost anything. And right now, Katie had noticed something that terrified her. The quantum fold drive, the massive engine that let the ship jump across space, was making the wrong sound. She could feel it through the walls every time she worked in the lower tunnels. A vibration that didn't match the normal rhythm. It was subtle, something you'd only notice if you spent hours every day pressed against the ship's inner workings, but it was there. And it was getting worse. For 3 days, Katie had felt the vibration growing stronger. She'd heard the Dracovian engineers talking about the upcoming ceremonial jump through the Nexus Gate, a big show of imperial power in front of representatives from hundreds of worlds. She'd also heard them discussing what happened when a quantum fold drive failed during a jump. The ship would tear itself apart from the inside out. Everyone would die in seconds. There would be nothing left but scattered atoms floating in space. Katie knew she had to tell someone. The problem was that nobody listened to human slaves, especially not children. But she had to try. She couldn't just let thousands of people die, even if most of them treated her like she was worthless. She found Master Technician Vex in the main engineering bay, reviewing displays of ship systems. He was one of the senior engineers, his dark green scales marked with the symbols of his rank. Katie approached carefully, keeping her head down the way slaves were supposed to. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Master Technician," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The drive chamber, it's..." "Silence, human." Vex didn't even turn to look at her. His voice was filled with the casual contempt that all Dracovians seemed to have for her species. "You clean. You don't think..." The drive was inspected by the Imperial Engineering Corps just yesterday. Perfection doesn't need advice from slaves who can barely understand how a door works. Katie tried again. "But Master, I can feel something wrong in the..." "Are you deaf as well as stupid?" Vex finally turned and his eyes were cold. "Touch nothing but what you're assigned to clean. Speak to no engineers unless spoken to first. If you break this rule again you'll be punished. Now get back to your duties before I have you whipped." Katie backed away, her stomach twisting with fear and frustration. She tried. She'd done what she could. But they wouldn't listen. They never listened to humans because humans were nothing to them. Just tools. Just slaves. Just things. But that vibration in the walls kept growing stronger. And tomorrow the ship would make its jump. Tomorrow, unless someone did something, everyone aboard would die. The Dracovians in their arrogance had made a mistake they couldn't even see. Katie realized with cold certainty that if she wanted to save this ship, she'd have to do it herself. The throne room aboard the Imperial Dreadnought looked like something out of a dream. Massive windows stretched across one entire wall, showing the endless expanse of space with stars scattered like diamonds on black velvet. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, each one worth more than an entire planet's economy. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the elaborate clothing of dignitaries from over 100 different worlds who had gathered for this moment. Emperor Draken sat on his command throne in the center of it all, elevated above everyone else as a constant reminder of who held the power. His crimson scales caught the starlight and seemed to glow with an inner fire. He was ancient by any species standards, having ruled the Dracovian Empire for over 2 centuries. His eyes swept across the assembled crowd with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. Ambassadors, senators, governors, and representatives from countless worlds stood in their finest clothing, all here to witness what the Empire called a ceremonial jump through the Nexus Gate. But everyone in that room understood what this really was. It wasn't just a demonstration of technology. It was a reminder. A message written in power and steel that said the Dracovian Empire could go anywhere, do anything, reach any world, and conquer any people. Resistance was pointless. Rebellion was suicide. The Empire was eternal and unstoppable. The Nexus Gate itself hung in space ahead of them, a massive structure built by some long-dead civilization that nobody really understood anymore. It created shortcuts through space, letting ships cross distances that would normally take years in just seconds. Jumping through it required perfect timing and flawless engineering. It was dangerous, spectacular, and exactly the kind of show that Draken loved to put on. While the powerful and important gathered above, deep in the ship's lower decks where slaves lived and worked, Katie made her decision. The vibration in the walls had become so bad that she could feel it even when standing still. Time was running out. Nobody had listened to her warnings, which meant she had to act alone. She'd managed to steal a maintenance badge from an overseer who'd fallen asleep during his shift. Not that it really mattered. The old access tunnels she needed to reach weren't even monitored anymore. The Dracovians had built this ship centuries ago, back when they still believed in backup systems and redundancy. Modern Dracovian engineering didn't bother with such things. They believed their technology was perfect, which meant backups were unnecessary. They'd literally forgotten the old tunnels existed. Katie squeezed into one of these forgotten passages, crawling on her hands and knees through darkness lit only by the faint glow of emergency strips that hadn't been replaced in decades. The metal around her hummed and vibrated with increasing intensity. She could feel the wrongness growing worse with every passing second. The quantum fold drive was minutes away from catastrophic failure, and the ceremonial jump was about to start. Above her, on the command deck where the ship's operations were controlled, Master Engineer Vex stood at his station going through pre-jump checks. Everything on his display showed green. Perfect. Optimal. Exactly as expected. He allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. The human slave's warnings yesterday had been laughable. Primitive creatures always feared what they couldn't understand. All systems optimal, Your Majesty, Vex announced proudly, his voice carrying across the command deck and broadcasting into the throne room where the Emperor and his guests waited. We are ready to begin the jump sequence. Emperor Draken raised one clawed hand in a gesture that was both permission and command. Proceed. The ship's quantum fold drive began to spin up, drawing enormous amounts of power from the reactors. Space itself started to bend around the dreadnought as the drive prepared to fold reality like a piece of paper, bringing 2 distant points together. The guests in the throne room gasped and pointed as the stars outside began to stretch and blur in ways that human eyes weren't meant to see. Then, deep in the quantum core, something went terribly wrong. The cascading resonance that Katie had felt for days finally reached critical mass. The drive didn't just malfunction. It started to tear itself apart from the inside, and the ship was already committed to the jump. There was no turning back now. Alarms erupted across every deck of the ship. The sound was deafening, a wailing siren that meant catastrophic system failure. On the command deck, Vex displays went from calm green to screaming red in the span of a single heartbeat. His scales actually turned pale as he realized what he was seeing. The impossible was happening. His perfect systems were failing. Abort the jump. Emperor Draken roared, rising from his throne as the ship began to shake around them. The dignitaries screamed and scrambled for cover. We can't abort, Your Majesty. Vex's voice cracked with panic. We're already in the fold. The drive is experiencing a cascading resonance failure. If we stop the jump now, we'll be torn apart. But if we complete it like this, the result will be the same. Then fix it. Draken's eyes blazed with fury and fear. There's no time. We have seconds before. The ship shuddered violently. Through the throne room windows, the assembled guests watched in horror as energy began to leak from the hull in bright blue streams. Space itself was twisting wrong, reality warping in ways that made people's eyes hurt to look at. They were watching their own deaths approach in slow motion. Deep in the forgotten tunnels, Katie felt every terrible second of it. The passage around her shook so violently that her teeth rattled. Heat built up fast, turning the cramped space into an oven. Warning lights she didn't even know existed flickered to life, bathing everything in angry red. Radiation alarms wailed in frequencies that hurt her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run, to hide. But Katie pushed forward instead, her small body squeezing through passages that hadn't been opened in generations. She knew where she needed to go. She knew what she had to do. The only question was whether she could reach it in time. The security team found Katie crumpled in a forgotten access tunnel 3 levels below the engine room. She wasn't moving. Her skin was covered in angry red blisters from radiation exposure, the kind of burns that killed most people within hours. Her small hands were still wrapped around a piece of broken metal pipe she'd used as a lever, fingers locked in place even though she was unconscious. The medical team had to carefully pry her hands open to get her onto a stretcher. When they pulled up the security footage to figure out what had happened, the Dracovian engineers couldn't believe what they were seeing. The recording showed a tiny human girl crawling through passages that hadn't been opened in over a century. It showed her reaching an ancient manual override system that none of the modern engineers even knew existed. It showed her struggling with a lever that was rusted shut, then using a piece of pipe to create leverage, throwing her entire body weight onto it until the emergency vent finally opened and released the pressure that would have destroyed the ship. A human child, an 11-year-old slave, had just saved the Emperor's flagship and everyone on it. Katie woke up slowly, her mind foggy and confused. Everything hurt. Her skin felt like it was on fire. She tried to open her eyes but the light was too bright. She tried to move but her body wouldn't respond properly. Then she felt something pressed gently but firmly against her shoulder, holding her down. "Be still, child." The voice was deep and rumbling, like thunder rolling across distant mountains. Katie's eyes flew open despite the pain. She was lying in what looked like a medical bay, her body wrapped in shimmering blue fields that hummed softly. Medical equipment she didn't recognize surrounded her bed. And standing right next to her, close enough to touch, was Emperor Draken himself. For a moment, Katie thought she must be dreaming or maybe dying or both. Slaves never saw the Emperor. They lived their entire lives without ever being in the same room as him. The idea that she would wake up to find him standing beside her bed watching her was impossible. Yet here he was, his crimson scales reflecting the medical equipment's lights, his ancient eyes fixed directly on her face. "Your Majesty, I'm so sorry, I wasn't supposed to be in those areas. I know I broke the rules but I had to." The words tumbled out of Katie's mouth in a terrified rush. "You weren't supposed to access restricted areas," Draken interrupted, his voice quiet but somehow filling the entire room. "You weren't supposed to touch Imperial systems. You weren't supposed to understand technology that our own engineers barely comprehend." He leaned closer, and Katie could see her own reflection in his eyes. "So tell me, child, how did you know the drive was failing?" Katie swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "The vibration, Your Majesty. I felt it in the walls when I was working in the maintenance tunnels. The frequency was wrong. It didn't match what it was supposed to sound like. I knew something was breaking down in the quantum core. I tried to tell the technicians but they wouldn't listen to me because you're human," Draken finished for her. His voice had gone very cold. "Because humans are primitive. Because humans are weak and stupid and short-lived and couldn't possibly understand anything important." He studied her face for a long moment. "What else have you noticed that my engineers have missed?" Katie hesitated. Telling the Emperor that his ship had problems felt dangerous. But he'd asked for the truth, and lying to an Emperor seemed even more dangerous. "Your Majesty, I really don't think I should." "The truth, child," Draken said firmly. "I give you my word that I won't punish you for speaking honestly. In fact, I'm ordering you to tell me everything you've observed." So Katie took a deep breath and told him. She explained how the coolant system in Section 7 had been running 10% hotter than it should for the past 2 months, slowly building toward a failure that nobody had caught. She described the backup power grid relay that sparked every 47 cycles, a pattern she'd noticed while replacing burnt circuits nearby. She mentioned the observation deck's viewport that had a tiny crack in it, barely visible but growing larger each week. Eventually it would shatter and kill everyone in that room when the vacuum of space rushed in. "And there's more," Katie said quietly, her voice getting smaller. "Your engineers don't listen when slaves try to tell them things. They think we're too stupid to understand anything. But we're not stupid, Your Majesty. We see things because we're small enough to go places they can't reach. We hear things because we're quiet and people forget we're there. We notice patterns because we have to be smart to survive. We pay attention because if we don't, we die." Katie hadn't realized that other people had entered the medical bay while she was talking. When she finally looked around, she saw that Emperor Draken's entire command staff had gathered behind him. Master Engineer Vex was there, his face unreadable. The Chief of Security. The Master of Ships. Officers whose names Katie didn't even know. All of them staring at her in complete silence. Emperor Draken straightened to his full height, towering over the bed where Katie lay. "You saved this ship," he said slowly, each word deliberate and clear. "You saved thousands of lives. You saved dignitaries from 100 worlds. You saved me." He paused, letting that sink in. "Tell me, Katie of Earth. What should I do with you now?" Katie's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. She knew what happened to slaves who broke rules, who went into restricted areas, who touched things they weren't supposed to touch. But she also knew this might be the only chance she'd ever get to say what needed to be said. So she looked directly into the Emperor's ancient eyes, even though it terrified her, and spoke the truth. "Let me help, Your Majesty. Let humans help. We're not useless. We're just underestimated. Give us a chance to show you what we can really do." The medical bay stayed silent for what felt like forever. Then Emperor Draken made a decision that would change everything. 2 years had passed since a little girl crawled through forgotten tunnels to save a ship. Now Lieutenant Katie stood on the bridge of the Starfire, a patrol vessel that belonged to her. At 13 years old, she was the youngest officer in the entire Dracovian fleet. She was also the most unusual, and not just because of her age. The bridge of the Starfire looked different from other Imperial vessels. Most ships in the fleet were commanded by towering Dracovians with crews of their own kind. Katie's bridge was smaller, designed for mixed species, and her crew was unlike anything the Empire had ever seen before. Standing at the engineering station was Ryan, a human who'd survived the destruction of Earth's outer colonies and spent 5 years as a slave before Katie requested him for her crew. At navigation sat Krell, a Vexian whose 4 arms could operate controls faster than any Dracovian, and who still had scars on his neck from the slave collar he'd worn until 2 years ago. In the communications pod were 3 Minorans, beings barely 3 feet tall whose small size let them access systems and maintenance areas that larger species couldn't reach. 2 years ago, every single one of them would have been considered inferior, disposable, barely worth noticing. Now they ran the most efficient vessel in their entire sector, and other ships were starting to copy their methods. "Lieutenant, we're picking up a distress call," Ryan called out from his station, his fingers flying across the controls. "It's a civilian freighter, the Harmony. They're under attack by raiders in Sector 9, approximately 40 minutes away at standard speed." Katie didn't hesitate. "Set intercept course immediately. Krell, I need maximum speed." The Vexian navigator's 4 eyes blinked in concern. "Lieutenant, the Starfire isn't designed to sustain maximum speed for that duration. The engines will overheat. Fleet regulations say—" "I know what the regulations say," Katie interrupted, but her voice was gentle, not harsh. "I also know this ship can do better than what it was designed for if we're smart about it. Ryan, can you reroute coolant from the secondary systems to the main engines?" Ryan was already working before she finished asking. "On it. If I pull coolant from life support in the empty cargo bay and push it through the engine manifolds, we can run hot for about 30 minutes before we risk damage. That's all we need. Make it happen. Krell, as soon as Ryan gives you the green light, push those engines as hard as they'll go." The Starfire leaped forward like a hunting cat spotting prey. The ship wasn't supposed to move this fast. The Dracovian engineers who designed it had built it to be reliable and safe, following centuries of tradition and established rules. They'd never imagined a crew that would look at those rules and find creative ways around them. Back at Imperial Command, warning lights started flashing on monitoring stations. A supervisor looked at his display in confusion. "The Starfire is exceeding maximum rated speed by 40%. Send them a priority message. They're going to damage their engines." Katie saw the incoming message on her screen and ignored it. She'd learned something important over the past 2 years. The Dracovian Empire had become so powerful that they'd stopped innovating. They built things the way they'd always built them, did things the way they'd always done them, and never questioned whether there might be a better approach. They relied on their superior size, their advanced technology, and centuries of tradition. Humans didn't have any of those advantages, which meant humans had learned to improvise. To look at a problem from angles nobody else considered. To use what they had in ways it wasn't meant to be used. Katie and her mixed crew had taken those human traits and combined them with the best qualities of every species aboard. Ryan's creativity, Krell's precision, the Minorans' ability to think in 3 dimensions at once. They reached the freighter in 22 minutes, half the time it should have taken. The raiders were still there, 3 small attack ships trying to breach the freighter's hull. But the moment the Starfire dropped out of faster-than-light travel, the raiders scattered and ran. They knew exactly who commanded this patrol vessel. Katie's reputation had spread across the sector over the past 2 years. She was the human who saved Emperor Draken. The child who became an officer. The lieutenant who won battles by thinking in ways nobody expected. Freighter Harmony, this is Imperial Starfire, Katie transmitted on the standard emergency channel. The raiders are gone. You're safe now. Do you need medical assistance or repairs? There was a pause before the response came back. Thank you, Starfire. Is it true? Are you really commanded by a human? Katie smiled. She got asked that question at least once a week. I really am. My name is Lieutenant Katie. We'll escort you to the nearest station to make sure you get there safely. Thank you, Lieutenant. You just saved our lives. While Katie and her crew protected civilian ships in deep space, massive changes were happening across the entire Dracovian Empire. Back on the homeworld, in the Imperial Palace, Emperor Draken sat in his council chamber surrounded by advisors who would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. The room held Dracovians, yes, but also humans, Vexians, Minorans, and representatives from a dozen other species that used to be classified as lesser beings, as conquered people, as slaves. The old master engineer Vex was there too, though he'd been demoted after the drive failure. He sat quietly, listening as a human engineer explained a new propulsion system that improved efficiency by 30%. The engineer's name was Beth, and 2 years ago she'd been cleaning waste recycling systems. Now she was revolutionizing how the Empire's ships moved through space. Emperor Draken watched it all with satisfaction. That day when Katie saved his ship, she taught him something more valuable than any military victory. She'd shown him that his empire had been throwing away its most valuable resource by judging species on size and strength instead of intelligence and creativity. Now he was fixing that mistake, and the results were exceeding even his most optimistic predictions. Admiral Katie sat in the war room of the Imperial Palace, surrounded by the most powerful military officers in the Dracovian Empire. At 14 years old, she commanded an entire battle group now, 5 ships under her direct authority. It still felt surreal sometimes. 3 years ago she'd been a slave crawling through maintenance tunnels. Now she sat at the table where the Empire made decisions about war and peace. The summons to this meeting had come suddenly, marked urgent. Katie had jumped her flagship across 2 sectors to get here in time. Looking around the room at the grim faces, she knew something serious was happening. Emperor Draken stood at the head of the table, his crimson scales looking darker than usual in the war room's harsh lighting. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. We have a problem. The Korthian Dominion has officially declared war on the Dracovian Empire. They see our reforms over the past 3 years as weakness. They believe we've become soft by freeing our slaves and promoting inferior species to positions of power. Their fleet is mobilizing and they're coming with everything they have. A cold silence filled the room. Everyone there knew about the Korthians. They were the nightmare that parents from a dozen species used to scare children into behaving. 8 feet tall with armored hides that could stop most conventional weapons. Their culture was built entirely around conquest and domination. They'd never been defeated in open warfare, and they'd been watching the Dracovian Empire's transformation over the past 3 years with barely concealed contempt. How long do we have before they arrive? Katie asked, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. 2 months, maybe less if they push their ships hard, Draken replied. Their fleet is massive. 300 warships, maybe more. They want to make an example of us, to show the galaxy what happens to empires that go soft. What are our options? Asked General Thax, one of the traditional Dracovian military commanders. For the next hour, the generals laid out their strategies. Most of them followed the old Dracovian way of warfare. Meet strength with strength. Mass their fleet at a choke point. Use superior firepower and numbers. fight the kind of battle the Empire had been fighting for centuries. It was the way they'd always won, the tried and true method that had built the Empire in the first place. Katie listened to all of it, saying nothing. She watched the tactical displays, studied the proposed battle formations, calculated the numbers in her head. And the more she heard, the more certain she became that the traditional approach would fail. When the generals finally finished presenting their plans, Katie spoke up quietly. "With respect, we can't beat them that way." The room went silent. General Thax's scales bristled with irritation. "Admiral Katie, you're young and talented, but you lack experience in fleet-scale warfare. The Corthians are stronger than us ship to ship. Our only advantage is meeting them with concentrated force at a strategic location." "Exactly," Katie said. "They're stronger than us in direct combat. They know it. We know it. That's why they declared war in the first place. They're counting on us to fight them the traditional way, and if we do that, we'll lose." She stood up and walked to the tactical display. "But they're making the same mistake that everyone has made about humans for centuries." Emperor Draken leaned forward in his throne, his ancient eyes focused intently on Katie. "Which is?" "They're underestimating us," Katie said simply. "The Corthians think diversity is weakness. They look at our mixed crews, our reformed society, our alliance of different species working together, and they see it as proof that we've gone soft. They think we've sacrificed strength for sentiment." She pulled up new tactical displays, showing formations and strategies that made several of the traditional generals gasp in surprise. "They're wrong. Let me show you how." Over the next 2 months, Katie worked day and night with the most unlikely team the galaxy had ever seen. Human tacticians like Ryan, who'd served on her ship, brought creativity and adaptability. They looked at the Corthian fleet and saw not an unstoppable force, but a rigid, predictable pattern that could be exploited. Vexian engineers modified ship systems in ways the original designers never imagined, increasing efficiency and speed. Minoran communication specialists developed new coordination protocols that let mixed-species crews operate with precision that pure Dracovian crews couldn't match. And yes, Dracovian warriors brought their strength and their courage, the raw power that had built the Empire. They combined perspectives that had never worked together before in military history. Human adaptability that refused to follow the rules. Vexian precision that executed plans perfectly. Minoran creativity that thought in dimensions others couldn't see. Dracovian strength that could break through any defense. Together they built something new. Not a traditional fleet, but something the Corthians wouldn't know how to fight. When the Corthian Dominion's massive fleet finally arrived at the edge of Dracovian space, their commanders were confident. They'd studied the Empire's traditional tactics. They knew how Dracovians fought. They expected formation combat, strength against strength, the kind of grinding battle they'd won 100 times before. What they got instead was something they'd never seen. Katie's battle group didn't meet them head-on. They split, reformed, attacked from unexpected angles, used the environment in ways that weren't in any traditional military doctrine. Human-led ships made decisions that seemed insane but somehow worked. Mixed crews operated with coordination that pure species forces couldn't achieve. The Battle of the Nexus Gate lasted 3 brutal days, but when it ended, the Corthian fleet was in full retreat. They'd been outthought, outmaneuvered, and ultimately defeated not by superior strength, but by something they'd never valued. Intelligence. Creativity. The willingness to try new things.